In this lesson, I'm going to be talking about how to simplify complex numbers. So in order to simplify complex numbers, there's one thing that we have to keep in mind, and that has to do with the fact that I, the imaginary unit I equals to radical of -1. And from this, if we square both sides, we have a very useful identity I square equals to -1. So this is a very useful identity that we need sometimes to simplify complex numbers. The very first thing we want to do is how do we add two complex numbers? So we're going to be basically talking about four mathematical operations with complex numbers, starting with addition, moving on to subtraction, then we'll talk about multiplication, and finally the division. Starting with the easiest type first, the addition. I always like to illustrate these concepts with an example. The first example I'm going to use is, let's say we have 3 plus 2i, which is a complex number. Why is this a complex number? Because this has a real part and it has an imaginary part as well. So if I have this complex number and I want to add another complex number, 4 minus 3i. So if I want to add these two complex numbers, the first thing I have to do is we have to look for the real parts of the first one and the real part of the second one. Similarly, we also have to look for the imaginary part of the first one and the imaginary part of the second one. So in a way, it kind of works similar to how you would add polynomial functions. You try to combine like terms. In this case, the like terms have to do with the real parts and the imaginary parts. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get rid of the parentheses for the first one as well as the second one. So I'm going to rewrite 3 plus 2i plus 4 minus 3i. So in the first step, I just got rid of the parentheses. I also kind of followed the order of operations, which says you have to first get rid of the parentheses. Once I get rid of the parentheses, then I quickly realized that I can combine like terms. In this case, the like terms are the real pieces, which is this 3 and positive 4. So I combine them, I write them next to each other, 3 plus 4. Similarly, I'm going to also combine the imaginary parts. The imaginary parts being positive 2i, so I'm going to write positive 2i, and then the other imaginary piece is negative 3i. So I simply combined like terms or wrote them next to each other. Moving on, this equals to 3 plus 4 is 7. That takes care of the real part, and then I have plus 2 minus 3, which is just minus 1i. So we don't have to write 1, we can simply write I. So it's 7 minus I. From simplifying this sum of two complex numbers, we have finally a complex number. Again, sometimes it's also useful and sometimes it's also asked in the problems, what is the real and the imaginary part? So if you look at the final result, the real part here is positive 7, which is this one, and the imaginary part is the quantity which is in front of the I. In front of the I, although we don't see any quantity here, but we know there's always that invisible 1, so the imaginary part is -1. So we have both real and imaginary part, and we have a complex number right here. Okay, so moving on to example 2. So that was the addition. Let us look at a subtraction problem. For the subtraction, I'm actually going to use three complex numbers. So let's say we have 4 minus 2i. This is one of my complex numbers. And I want to subtract 3 plus 6i. Again, subtract 2 minus 14i. Okay. So now we are not adding them, we are subtracting them. Whether we are adding them or subtracting them, the first step is still going to be the same. We are going to try to get rid of the parentheses. So I can simply write the second step by getting rid of the parentheses. For the first one, when I get rid of the parentheses, I simply am left with 4 minus 2i. But for the second two pieces, you have to be careful because there's a negative outside the parentheses. So you have to first try to distribute that negative carefully with both of these terms before you get rid of the parentheses. So negative distributed with 3 will give me -3. Negative distributed with positive will still give me -6i. So that takes care of the second piece. Again, I have a minus here. And then the parentheses. So this minus has to be distributed with both of these terms. So minus times 2 is -2. But then we also know that the negative times negative is a positive. So it's going to be a positive 14i. I want you guys to be very careful when you distribute these negatives. Well, here both of them are positive, so both the signs are going to change. But here one of them is a negative quantity. So when negative times negative, when you multiply negative with a negative, you get a positive. So please be careful with that piece. Once you get rid of the parentheses, then the next obvious step is to combine the like terms. So in this case, like terms again are the real pieces as well as the imaginary pieces. So I'm going to write the real pieces next to each other. 4 is the first real piece. Then I have a -3 and then a -2. So 4 -3 -2, that takes care of the real pieces. Please don't forget the imaginary. I have to combine the imaginary ones. This one, and then I have the final one right here. So this is -2i, -6i, and plus a 14i. Trying to simplify this, 4 minus 3 is 1, 1 minus 2 is -1, so we don't even need a calculator for that. -2, -2, and -6, they kind of add up to -8, -8 plus 14. So -8 plus 14 is positive 6i. So we have the simplified form when we subtracted 3 different complex numbers. From here, you can easily identify the real piece, which is -1, and you can also identify the imaginary piece, which is just 6. So that is simply adding and subtracting complex numbers. So what is the common mistake that I find sometimes students do is, when they see something like this, a plus here, they start to distribute this 3 with 4 and then this 3 with -3i. So they try to use what they like to call as a FOIL or distribution. But guys, you have to be very careful. It does not mean that you are multiplying these two complex numbers. It means that you are just simply trying to add the two complex numbers, and there's a difference between addition and multiplication. So this is only adding. Here this is subtracting. You are not trying to distribute this complex number with that one. You're just trying to subtract them. So this is adding, subtracting. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about how to multiply and how to divide two complex numbers, because that requires a little bit more work, that has more steps. And then we are also going to be using this identity I square equals to -1. Okay.